Our story begins in a workshop filled with various weapons that had been forged there. The furnace was lit and there was a blond young man with light-colored eyes who was practically drooling over the sword that had just come out of the forge. Then, without hesitation, he suddenly put the sword in his mouth and began to eat it. Since he was young, his father had often told him a story. His father wanted him to remember it very well, and the name of the boy who listened to his father's tale was Arhan. Arhan was a member of the caravan family, and that was why he needed to remember it. There was the image of a man on the wall, and beneath it, a sword. Arhan's father made it very clear that, although they were living in a small village far from the capital, 200 years ago, the status of their family was unmatched by any other. They had a knight known as the God of War. He was one of the most righteous warriors and was favored by the king. He was also highly respected by all, and their family had been chosen by the sword. They had produced sword masters for generations, and that was why everyone treated them with respect. The caravan family was known as the Invincible Protectors. Arhan would soon inherit his father's position and become the head of the caravan family. His father wanted him to always be proud of the caravan family, proud of the blood flowing through his veins. The boy's father wanted him to restore the family's glory and remain at the highest ranks as a protector of that land, for that was his family's duty. Then, the scene shifted to an immense field of wheat. Arhan was working in that wheat field, recalling the heroic stories of his family that his father used to tell. He was sweating heavily under the sun, believing that all those stories his father told were nothing more than feudal tales, and that they were nothing but disgraced nobles clinging to past glory. After all, that was quite common. He thought that if the caravan family's stories were true, they would not be living in that poor village as mere landowners. They would not be spending their days doing farm work alongside the tenants. Moreover, Arhan found many inconsistencies in the stories his father told. The founder of his family, the idolized figure in the portrait, no matter how much he looked at it, did not resemble either his father or himself. Even the sword that had been passed down through generations, supposedly forged hundreds of years ago, was still extremely sharp and completely intact. The strangest part to Arhan was that not a single history book of the kingdom mentioned the ancestral name that had left that legacy, a man called Liam Caravan. Arhan Caravan had done everything he could to find any mention of his ancestor, but he never succeeded. Taking all of that into account, he reached only one conclusion. Suddenly, someone interrupted his train of thought, calling him young master and asking why he was standing there, as he seemed lost. That person, dressed in humble clothing, smiled and told Arhan that it was snack time, and that if he did not hurry, he would miss the warm bread, since everyone else would eat it all, and he would be left with nothing. In the end, Arhan became a little frantic, as he did not want to miss the warm bread. In any case, he did not mind that the caravan family was not great anymore. In the end, everyone there treated him very well, and he loved that place because he could live alongside those people. Ultimately, that was the caravan family he truly wanted. Everything was exactly as he liked it, when suddenly the scene changed to blood on the ground among countless bodies. The wheat was completely stained with blood, sharply contrasting with the peaceful and complacent state Arhan had believed existed until then. The scene shifted again to Arhan on horseback, telling everyone that he had probably gathered enough for the day. He said he would go to the market in the neighboring city, and the villagers bade him farewell. He also said that he would buy whatever they needed while he was there. Then he called Kun, the young man who had spoken to him earlier, and asked whether he would like some apples, remembering that Kun had complained that he had not seen fruit in quite some time. Kun felt a bit embarrassed, but thought it would be wonderful if his young master brought them. Arhan also remembered Marino's youngest daughter, whose birthday was approaching. He said he would bring her a pretty doll if he found one in the city, and Marino was surprised that Arhan knew about it. Arhan smiled and said he knew everything. After all, he would be the next lord of that land, so he should know these things. With that, he said his goodbyes and promised he would return soon. The people wished their young master a safe journey. He set off as the sun was already setting. Kun thought there was no one like their young master, and the old man beside him agreed, saying that Arhan was very different from other nobles. Marino worried that some noble lady might steal Arhan away from them. At that, Kun hoped that if that ever happened, it would be too late. Then he called everyone to finish the remaining work, reminding them that it was the day of the regular meeting with the Lord. However, at the exact moment he said that, his face was split in half before everyone's eyes, and blood began to spill. The entire field was stained with blood, as the others were attacked as well, and that land was completely erased. A long-haired man appeared and slaughtered all of them. The people trembled in his presence, and the long-haired man spoke briefly, declaring that the land needed to be erased. His movements were swift, cutting everyone in half before leaving without taking anything. Later that night, Arhan arrived at the place and dropped the apples and the toy he had bought. His voice trembled as he saw everyone lying dead on the ground. He wanted to understand why everyone had been killed, but the old man appeared behind him and covered his eyes, asking the young master not to look. The old man was the butler, and Arhan immediately recognized him, saying that something was terribly wrong. Arhan thought he was seeing things, while the butler wept. Arhan began to cry desperately, screaming for the villagers. The butler told his young master that the one responsible for everything had come, declaring that the caravan family needed to be completely erased. The entire massacre had taken only 10 minutes, and the butler explained the mysterious man had wielded his sword with inhuman coldness against everyone. He appeared without warning and, in a short time, took half the lives of the villagers. He destroyed all the houses with his sword and said that he was merely following orders. In that way, half of the caravan family fell and was erased without leaving a trace. All of that disaster was caused by a sword master. Then, the scene shifted to a massive house where Arhan entered together with his butler. Amid the terrible and unexpected disaster, he saw the bodies on the ground and soon began to cry upon realizing that most of them had lost their heads. His mother appeared, desperate, screaming his name. He could hardly believe she was there, and that sight was his only glimpse of hope. Arhan's mother hugged him tightly. She felt immense relief upon seeing that her son was safe and an overwhelming happiness because of it. Arhan was confused, but at that moment, the warmth of his mother's embrace brought him a fleeting sense of relief. Soon after, he began to cry again, and it was then that he realized something. His father arrived, wanting to understand what was happening. He was visibly shaken and held a cloth in his hands. Arhan could see that, in truth, the tragedy had only just begun. For some reason, the swordmaster, who had exterminated half of the caravan family's territory in an instant, had not harmed his parents, and had merely delivered those words, that he would return in 1 month. If everyone wished to leave that place alive, they had to leave immediately. Arhan's father cried heavily. He wanted to understand why that mysterious man was doing such a thing, and what kind of crime his family had committed. The swordmaster said that he was merely following orders. After leaving behind words that could not be fully understood, the villagers, one by one, began to leave the village, and that may have been the only way to save their lives. In the end, the family had no choice, and Arhan's father was crushed by the weight of his responsibility. He eventually collapsed under it, reading books and searching for help in a religious manner. Arhan saw his father's powerlessness as the lord of those lands, and he did not want to abandon that place. At that moment, Arhan's mother called for him and said that the butler should prepare a carriage. That day, she would send him as far away from those lands as possible. Arhan was caught off guard by his mother's words. He tried to understand what she meant and made it clear that she also needed to leave, just like his father. Arhan wanted everyone to leave together. The woman explained to her son that his father could not leave that place because until the very end, he would want to face the enemy as the lord of caravan. As his partner, Arhan's mother believed it was her duty to stay by her husband's side until the end. Soon, Arhan's voice broke as he begged his mother not to do that and to change her mind. However, she completely ignored his despair and told him that he needed to remember that the stories his father had told were not true. All those stories about them being known as honorable guardians or invincible protectors were nothing more than lies. The boy cried bitterly at all of this, and deep down, he already felt that it was a lie. Soon, his mother asked if he would make her a promise. She wanted him to promise that he would never pick up a sword in his life. She wanted him to promise that he would survive, no matter how. She also wanted Arhan to never even think about revenge, and above all else, wished for him to live for himself. Suddenly, the butler informed his mistress that the carriage was ready, and the boy became desperate. Arhan's mother asked the butler to take very good care of her son, making sure they went as far away as possible before that man arrived. The butler was forced to drag the boy along, as he did not want to leave and resisted fiercely, screaming his mother's name in desperation. However, the woman saw no other way for things to be resolved, and the butler told his young master that they had to go. Arhan's mother was obviously suffering, but she had to make sacrifices to ensure her son's safety, making it clear that she loved her child. Then, the scene shifted to Arhan's father, who had smashed his head against the wall so many times that his forehead was bleeding heavily. His wife came to him and asked him to stop suffering alone, hugging him from behind. She believed that, at least until the very end, she would be with him. In that calm manner, the scene shifted to the carriage where the butler guided the horse. He made it clear to his young master that he understood how devastating the pain he was feeling must be, but asked Arhan to endure it. The butler believed that the swordmaster was a calamity, like a natural disaster, that humans like them could not overcome. All that remained for Arhan was to accept that tragedy for what it was and forget it, if he wished to continue living, saying that this was what his parents would have wanted for him, until the butler suddenly realized that his young master was no longer in the carriage and panicked. Arhan had jumped off the carriage. He simply could not accept leaving alone. He could not imagine how he could abandon his parents like that. He would not flee by himself, and so he ran back toward his home to find his parents again. Arhan believed that the sword master they called a calamity was still just a man like them, and that he too would die if an arrow pierced his heart. He had spent the last month preparing a deadly poison, and if he could strike the sword master with it, he could protect his parents. When he arrived at his home, his eyes widened, for what he saw left him completely in shock. His father's head was tied to his family's banner, and his mother lay on the ground. The swordmaster thought the boy was a complete fool for returning only to embrace death. The swordsman made it clear that he had shown mercy to Arhan, but that he would no longer let them escape. Arhan screamed in despair as he saw his mother on the ground and his father in that state. He quickly grabbed a crossbow and aimed it at the swordmaster, swearing that he would kill him. The swordmaster looked at Arhan with a sharp gaze, and the boy immediately dropped the crossbow. He fell to his knees, feeling something tighten in his throat, making him tremble. The swordmaster knew that the boy was not yet 18 and simply walked past him, telling Arhan that he should consider himself lucky because he would not take his life that day and would leave him to drown in his own despair. The swordmaster warned that there could not be a single trace of the caravan family's will to establish itself on that continent, and that Arhan should not dare to continue that bloodline. He told Arhan that he would meet him again, called him Caravan, and made it clear that he should disappear, just like his parents. Arhan went to his mother and cried, feeling utterly pathetic for having been unable to do anything. That day, he thought he had lost everything, until he stood before the image of his ancestor, and the sword gleamed, as if his ancestor wanted Arhan Caravan to show some respect, calling him his descendant. Then, the scene shifted to a night of a full moon. 1 year had passed since Arhan had buried everyone in that land. During that time, he prepared himself for revenge. The pinnacle, regarded as the strongest blade on the continent, was a protector who safeguarded the peace of the kingdom, a righteous guardian who destroyed evil, a transcendent being with the most brilliant talent among all swordmasters. The swordmaster Arhan sought to kill was named Carlos, also known as the Master of the 10 Swords. He was the man who had taken everything from him. Everything was a mystery, and Arhan still did not know why Carlos had killed his family. He also wanted to know who was behind it, since Carlos had merely been following orders. Moreover, Arhan wished to uncover the secrets the caravan family had been hiding. But one thing was certain to him: all the caravan lives that had been emptied and extinguished would never return. Even so, he saw the sword shining brightly right before him and wanted to understand what that meant. He began to believe that he had gone mad over this unsolvable problem. The sword possessed an overwhelming aura, and to Arhan, something unbelievable appeared before his eyes. His ancestor wanted him to show respect and called the boy his descendant. Arhan, who had believed everything was a lie, was now seeing the truth in the form of the legendary ancestor from the portrait. He had heard that those who suffered severe psychological trauma sometimes experience visions. However, what stood before him was far too vivid to be dismissed as a mere hallucination. The ancestor told the boy that he could feel the turbulence in his heart. Then he asked Arhan whether he feared that he had truly lost his mind. Arhan was deeply frightened and thought that if this situation were real and not an illusion, he wanted to know whether the figure before him was truly the founder of their family, the strongest swordsman in history, known as Liam Caravan. He wanted to know whether Liam Caravan was truly the one from his father's heroic tales and why he had appeared only now. That thought filled Arhan with anger, for Liam Caravan, known as the all-powerful swordsman, only Momine Senonsine, had only appeared at this moment. Liam explained that he had shown himself only now because he needed to confirm things for himself, and he warned Arhan that revenge was an exhausting path that should not even be started unless the boy was prepared to abandon everything. Liam Caravan revealed that he had been observing Arhan's daily life over the past year. Arhan's obsession with never letting go of the sword, not even for a single day, made Liam see that his descendant had talent, but also that the boy knew such efforts were trivial and hopeless. Even so, his will had never wavered. Liam then repeated the question of why he had appeared only now, saying that the answer was simple. The hatred in Arhan's eyes had finally reached the depth he desired. The old man also admitted that his patience had reached its limit, and his thirst for blood, to destroy the one who had mercilessly wiped out his descendants and the people of his territory, was immense. In the history of that continent, there was a truth that had never been denied. A swordmaster could only be killed by another swordmaster. Liam knew that Arhan knew this as well. That was precisely why the boy had been swinging his sword foolishly and had sworn revenge. However, Liam told him that even if he trained alone for his entire life, he would never reach Carlos's level. A swordmaster was a transcendent being, beyond the category of a mere human, a supreme realm that not even those called geniuses could comprehend. Among swordmasters, Carlos occupied an impossibly high position as a transcendent. Even in Liam's era of war, there were very few with such skill. Thus, no one of the current generation could kill Carlos, and as time passed, Carlos would only grow stronger. That revelation left Arhan completely shaken. He knew that the gap between himself and Carlos was enormous, but he had not imagined it was so vast as to be impossible to overcome. He did not want to watch that cursed man, who had taken everything from him, become a hero. He recalled how Carlos had overwhelmed him with nothing more than a glance. Liam then told his descendant that from that moment on, history would change, for he would help Arhan become a blade sharper and stronger than Carlos. After all, Liam wanted Arhan as a caravan to be the one to end that murderer. However, there was only one method, and the only path a caravan could walk was to devour Liam's sword. He called Arhan a descendant who had inherited blood of steel. Arhan's eyes widened at the information he had received. Then, the scene shifted to the workshop where Arhan now stood. The caravan bloodline was mixed with human and dwarf blood. He was heating the sword in the furnace, while Liam stood beside him, explaining that the sword had originated from him since he was half-dwarf. Although the physical traits of dwarves did not manifest, that blood had passed down a special ability to his descendants. That ability was to consume blades and absorb the memories and techniques of their wielders. This was the source of the power that allowed the caravan family to produce swordmasters generation after generation, and thus they rose as a great family. Arhan pondered the idea of devouring swords to inherit power. It was well known that dwarves were friends of steel and fire, but he had truly never heard of such a bizarre ability. Everything felt utterly absurd to Arhan. The stories only left him more confused, but the truth could only be proven by results, and he had no option called hesitation. Soon he asked his ancestor to tell him how he could consume the sword. Liam explained that the method of consumption was simple. Arhan only needed to heat the blade until it softened enough, then chew and swallow it. Arhan did so without thinking. At that moment, he felt that he might be trapped in a nightmare and losing his sanity, or perhaps merely possessed by a ghost. But among all those possibilities, if there was even the slightest chance that everything could change, he had to try. Thus, he bit into the blade with all his strength and felt his entire body burn, making him scream in agony. Soon he dropped the blade to the ground, smoke pouring from his mouth. He collapsed onto the floor, screaming as tears began to fall. His eyes reflected the searing pain he felt from the burning. He only needed to remember, and remembering was all he truly wanted. Once again, he began to devour the sword, forcing himself to believe that he would succeed. Even if it meant losing his life, he was willing to continue. He would become a swordmaster capable of killing Carlos. Then, the scene shifted to early morning. Arhan woke up in shock, unable to believe he was alive. Not only was he alive, but he did not have a single injury. The pain of chewing and swallowing heated steel had been undeniably real. He wondered if the previous day had all been a dream. But if it truly had been a dream, there would be no way that only the sword's hilt would remain there beside him. Soon after, Liam informed his descendant that, unlike his fragile body, his mental strength was truly praiseworthy. Even among the ancestors, many had given up because they were unable to endure the pain. Liam hoped that Arhan Caravan could believe his words, making it clear that the entire legend the boy's father had told was true. Liam emphasized that he was not a hallucination born from Arhan's mind. Arhan promptly expressed his reverence for the founder of the caravan family, but Liam asked his descendant to simply call him Master. Just like all those who had once received his teachings, Arhan wanted to know whether he had inherited, at that moment, all the great powers his father had always spoken of. After all, he remembered clearly that his ancestor had said the night before that consuming a sword would grant its power. However, he could not sense anything particularly different. Liam then told his descendant that there was a small problem with that, leaving Arhan confused. Liam explained that his original plan had been to feed Arhan his own sword and thus push him directly into the realm of a swordmaster. However, perhaps because the bloodline had thinned over the generations. Although the ability to consume swords remained, the ability to manage the power contained within them had weakened significantly. As a result, in Arhan's current state, it was impossible for him to fully digest the essence of Liam's sword, and that revelation struck the young man like a bomb. Still, Arhan told his master that he completely understood. Liam was surprised and asked if that was truly his entire reaction. The truth was that Arhan was already aware of his body's inadequacy. Although the result was disappointing, he was simply grateful that another possibility still existed. Liam did not understand what the boy meant, so Arhan explained that Liam himself had said that it was impossible in his current state, which meant that one day he would be able to manage that power. In other words, at that moment, Arhan believed he only needed to find a sword that matched his own capacity. He asked if he was correct, and Liam saw that Arhan's insight had already reached the level of a swordmaster. The more worn down by use, the better. Soon, Liam asked his disciple to guide him to a place filled with old and worn weapons, as he intended to make a selection. They arrived at a location that truly held an abundance of such items. Liam felt that the place possessed an extraordinary aura, one that dark mages would surely be pleased to encounter. Arhan explained to his master that everything discarded from the slums gathered there, from worthless scrap to completely unusable weapons. To find a sword that met the conditions his master had mentioned, Arhan believed there was no place more suitable than that one. Liam thought they were off to a good start. He told his disciple that he himself used to devour swords in places reeking of blood like this as well. Blades wielded by fallen soldiers, axes caked with dirt and blood, spears scattered about with broken shafts, and the like. Many times, Liam had devoured swords with all his might, all in order to grow stronger and survive. In some way, that place brought back Liam's old days, endless conflicts and battles fought to protect the flame of life. Some died there, while others lived to see tomorrow. Those battlefields, where countless lives had clashed, inevitably vanished without a trace. Even so, someone always left behind a single shining light. Liam had finally found it and wanted his young descendant to take advantage of what he was pointing at, declaring that this would be Arhan's second sword. The scene then shifted to 1 month later. Several men entered the place. They had heard that no one lived there anymore and that the village showed no signs of life. As such, they entered believing the mansion might have once been used by a dark mage as an experimental laboratory and later abandoned. At the same time, they thought that if that were true, they would die the moment they stepped inside. They then considered that perhaps a fallen noble was hiding there. One of them claimed he could smell a fallen noble and sneered that such people were arrogant and everywhere. When they found armchairs, they believed luck had finally smiled upon them, thinking the job would be easy. At that moment, one of them searched the place more thoroughly and noticed that a noble lady had once lived there. He pointed out the many fine women's garments, still fresh, unlike anything he had ever seen. Soon, he began to act foolishly and sniffed one of the clothes, saying it smelled different. The bald man beside him remarked that they could have fun in other ways as well. However, before they could search any further, Arhan ordered them to stop, catching them all by surprise. He told them that his mother liked everything kept very clean and hated disorder, and so he instructed them to put everything back in its place. After that, they could talk. The men who had invaded the mansion were utterly confused until one of them asked whether Arhan, whom he called a brat, was the son of the master of the mansion. Arhan then asked whether they had come merely looking for food or whether they needed a place to stay. He made it clear that if that were the case, he was willing to accept them as neighbors. The bald man could not understand what the hell Arhan was talking about and began to think that the blonde youth had gone insane. He also found it strange that nobles would show no fear at all. Gradually, he began to back away. Arhan thought the man should have stayed hidden and silent, but now could not understand why he was trying to retreat so sneakily. Believing that the boy was afraid of dying, the bald man charged toward him. At that exact moment, Arhan struck him with all his strength in the stomach, driving the sword straight through his body. At once, Arhan concluded that those men were not guests, and since they were not polite, they would not be guests at all. The scene then shifted to Arhan asking his master whether that really was the sword he was supposed to devour, since it did not even look like a proper sword. To him, it seemed more like a needle. He thought that if he tried to cut something with it, it would probably break. Liam explained to his disciple that this was natural, as the weapon had not been made to cut enemies or anything of the sort. The founder of the caravan family explained that the weapon had been created for a single purpose, in a duel of life and death, to pierce the enemy's vital point and end their life. That sword had been made for thrusting. Arhan had never imagined that a sword could be made solely for that purpose. He realized it felt unfamiliar to him, and Liam believed his descendant was thinking that a spear might have been better. Even so, Liam made it clear that such doubt was not wrong. However, with the fragile body Arhan possessed, nothing would be more useful than the memories stored within that sword. As a reference, the former owner of that sword, before dying, had pierced more than 200 enemies on her own. She had inhabited the body of a woman, far more delicate than Arhan's. For that reason, Liam wanted him to show respect to the sword and devour it with gratitude. The weight of the steel might be light, but what dwelled within it was a life of immense weight and solemnity. By inheriting that memory, Arhan would gain many things. That woman's final memory was of a mansion in flames. When she woke, her name was Melie. She was only 10 years old when she opened her eyes and realized that many things had changed. Her parents had been reduced to ashes by the fire, rendered unrecognizable even in form. When Melie realized that she had barely managed to save her own life, she murmured very softly that she had died together with her parents. After losing everything in a single instant, Melie went to live in a decrepit orphanage. On the day she discovered that the orphanage worshipped the goddess of fire and regarded fire as salvation, the child was dragged to the bottom of the well once more. After all, she had lost everything to fire and now had to live in a place that saw fire as salvation. salvation. She had not yet escaped the flames. The days that followed in that place were, at the same time, horrible and peaceful. Everyone was curious about why half of Millie's face was different. Some said she was cursed by the goddess, and so they began to treat the mark on her face as a curse. They felt disgusted looking at her and even considered her a monster. Millie began to believe it, and all she wanted was to leave that world and be with her parents. Every day she prayed for the end to come so that she could escape the flames of that day, which covered her face whenever she closed her eyes, and the flames of hatred that surrounded her when she opened them, until that day finally came. Looking back, Millie's sword was rustic and crude, yet still beautiful enough to make her forget, if only for a moment. A hell took hold and filled her mind. That man's name was Hegel, an old swordsman and former wandering knight who had worked at the orphanage for years. Normally, she would never have dared say a word to an old man with such a severe appearance. Even so, she approached him and wanted to know how she could become someone like him. She said she wanted to learn that. That was Millie's first step toward life. Hegel told the girl that it would not help her life very much, especially for someone like her. He made it clear that a blade like that would only hurt her and asked her to reconsider. Millie, however, thought that if she could at least learn that, perhaps she would fear no fire in the world. Those words caught Hegel's attention, and the scene shifted to him asking her to choose any sword from the barrel. If she could swing that sword, he would be willing to teach her. Millie asked if he was sure, and Hegel saw no reason to hesitate. She picked up a sword and thought that as long as she could stand and fight, anything would do. Then she pointed that slender sword toward Hegel. That was the first thrust Arhan delivered when he warned the unwanted guests that they had time to leave. The bald man crashed heavily to the ground, and everyone was shocked by what they had just seen. One of them believed it could only be a joke, but Arhan thought there was no longer any need to talk. Suddenly, Liam appeared at the scene. Over the past month, the founder of the caravan family had taught his young descendant only one thing, a method of endurance training, so that he would not tire even after running for hours. He had taught Arhan nothing about swordsmanship until then, but the fact that such a thrust had been possible meant that he truly was on the right path. Soon, Liam asked his young descendant to show his first steps as a caravan. The spot where the unwanted guest had been pierced could only be reached by digging precisely between the ribs and striking the lung. There was no way Arhan, who had no skill or experience with swords, could perform such a precise thrust. There was only one reason it had been possible, and Arhan believed he knew exactly what it was. It was because the owner of the slender sword Arhan had consumed a month earlier was Millie. After the day Millie managed to approach Hegel, he began teaching her many things, such as how to sew properly and how to hold a sword. He also taught her how to fight and survive. Although there was no systematic theory or rigid foundations, Hegel's swordsmanship carried romance and freedom, embodying the essence of a wandering knight's life. That technique possessed an indescribably beautiful strength for a young girl who feared fire. Millie truly loved Hegel's sword. The scene then shifts to several years later, when Hegel was lying in a bed. He told Millie that one day the time would come when she would leave that place. When that day came, he wanted her to do him a favor. With trembling hands, he asked her to go out into the free world. That was the last lesson he had to give her. He also said that he was happy that she had been the end of his journey in that world. Millie began to cry and thanked him for everything he had done. Hegel passed away right there, and she wished that he might rest in peace. After that, following Hegel's final lesson, she left the orphanage and set out into the world. Before long, she became known as a rather renowned mercenary. She did not know whether that was because she wielded an unusual sword thin as a needle, or because she was a young woman, something rare in that line of work. Thus, she became known as the seamstress gypsy. The scene then abruptly shifts to Aran, who believed that this must be what his master had meant by digestion. Millie's memories flowed through his mind as if they were speaking directly to him. In front of him, the bald man begged to be spared, pleading because he did not want to die. At that moment, Arhan began to spin the slender sword, displaying an absurd familiarity with the weapon. Then he drove the blade into the man lying on the ground, as if it were a skewer piercing meat ready for the grill. Arhan had finished it. That was the first time he had killed someone. But for a first time, it was surprising. He felt nothing. He simply observed the situation before him. Minutes earlier, the bald man had underestimated him, allowing Arhan to exploit an opening. Now, however, he knew he was at a numerical disadvantage and could not rely on the same luck again. Arhan believed his opponents were aware of this as well, but he could not understand why they did not attack, even though they had the numerical advantage. Liam Caravan, for his part, was certain that those men were terrified. Liam thought that reaction was more than expected, because the kind of movement his descendant had just displayed was not something that could come from a beginner. Moderate fear aided survival, but excessive fear ended up becoming a fog over objectivity. Those men began whispering among themselves because because they did not know what to do, and all they could manage at that moment was to tremble like bamboo in the wind. Liam believed that everything that had happened there inflated the image of his disciple in the eyes of those who saw him as an enemy, turning him into something greater than he truly was. In doing so, they distorted reality and began to believe that their opponent was far more powerful than he actually could be. In their eyes, at that moment, Arhan was a murderous demon, skilled with the sword. Arhan realized this quickly and advanced at great speed toward the three remaining men, believing that this was the right moment. One of them went into shock and shouted for Arhan not to come any closer, threatening to end his life and calling him a damn brat. He tried to strike Arhan, who dodged with ease. The man was terrified by such speed, and then Arhan drove the slender sword through his neck, like a needle. Hegel had once told Melly that because she had not been born with strength or endurance, time would never be on her side. Arhan then advanced at full speed toward the other man, who fell into despair. He tried to react, but Arhan leapt high. Because of that, within the first, or at most the second attack, Arhan believed he should pierce his enemy, and that was exactly what he did. He did not want to compensate for what he lacked. He would shine with what he possessed, just as Melly had. Melly's strength lay in her natural flexibility. Her body was like that of a dancer, and from any position or angle, she could aim for an enemy's throat. Only one of the invaders remained in Arhan's mansion, and he began to cry, unable to understand what was happening. To him, it felt as though he were in hell, being relentlessly pursued by an assassin. Later, still during the night, Arhan was digging a hole. Liam asked his disciple if he could set his doubts aside for the moment. He explained to the young descendant that if he had the endurance to swing a sword all day without losing his breath, then 4 untrained bandits would not be enough to bring him down, even if he were alone. That meant a caravan grew even stronger amid combat. Someone who loved life. Arhan realized that everything his master said was true. His body became as flexible as a dancer's, as if it were reacting to the memories contained within the sword and to Melly's recollections, which had become vivid the moment the fight began. Now Arhan was beginning to understand a little of what she had thought and with what kind of heart she had faced the world. He then wondered whether that was the power that made him stronger the more he understood his opponent. Exactly as his master had said, that was the power of digestion. Liam called his young descendant over and made it clear that he never lied when it came to the sword. As a guarantee, he warned Arhan that his future days would be filled with agony, a succession of hardships so great that death might one day seem preferable, so much so that the trial of that day would come to seem like a blessing. In this way, Liam wanted to know whether Arhan was willing to continue down that path. Arhan promptly told his master that if he could at least place a blade at Carlos's throat, then no matter what that path was, he was truly willing to keep moving forward. Despite the strong determination he showed at that moment, the scene shifts to Arhan with a choked voice, utterly frustrated. The scene was not very elegant due to the angle, but he was climbing the mountain and wanted to know whether that path truly was the right direction. There were many birds flying about. He was simply climbing to the summit, where there was a tree, and he could not believe that this was something serious. His master wanted to know where that look from the previous night had gone, and from that doubt, the conversation naturally arose. He also clarified that this trait was one of Arhan's strengths. He knew that his young descendant had always been like this since childhood. He had even needed to address it at some point. But first, he would satisfy Arhan's curiosity. He explained to his disciple that the path of a swordsman is broadly divided into 5 stages of mastery. A beginner with the sword can be called one who has entered the sword. The realm reached by those with martial talent is called the sword walker. The sword runners are those who establish themselves as the strong and serve as the axis of the battlefield. The sword specialist is a hero who can, alone, change the course of a war. Above all are those who reign over other swordsmen and are revered as gods, in the so-called realm of the sword of the heart, the sword master. Then he wanted the young descendant to answer where he believed he belonged among those his master had just mentioned. Arhan imagined that his master wanted an emphatic answer, but he knew his own level very well. Liam Caravan explained that the prerequisite for a sword master is the manipulation of mana. A reservoir is required to manipulate mana, much like a second heart, also known as the formation of a mana heart. Arhan had not yet formed a mana heart, and thus believed he did not even qualify as a beginner. Liam saw that Arhan possessed excellent clarity of mind, and made it clear to his young apprentice that he was, in fact, still an amateur among amateurs, someone who had not even stepped onto the threshold of the sword. Thus, that training aimed to guide someone like Arhan onto the path of a beginner. In doing so, he would create a mana heart, but that information took Arhan by surprise. He wanted to know whether he was truly taking such a risk merely to form a mana heart at that moment, since he was in a place where he could truly die if he made a single wrong move. Arhan had no idea what things had been like in his master's time, but in the present day, he knew that it was possible to create a mana heart by taking an alchemical potion, or by having a wandering class knight inject mana to open someone's senses. Even noble ladies, who had learned swordsmanship only for self-defense, could easily form a mana heart. So Arhan did not understand why his master chose such a difficult path when such an easy method existed, and still insisted on it. Arhan grew even more frustrated, and trembling greatly, only wanted to understand. Liam did not disagree with his disciple, for forming a mana heart in itself was not a difficult task. There was no reason Arhan could not do it by following the common path. However, the power of steadfast steel dwells in the blood of the caravans, and to wield that immense power, a resilient vessel is required. It is impossible to do so with that of an ordinary person. The realm that can be reached with a human heart is nothing more than the realm of humans. If Arhan truly wished to walk the path of a swordmaster, there was only one thing he needed to possess, something that would suffer no scratch, even if it collided with the world itself. That something was the heart of steel. There was only one way to forge it, to drive oneself endlessly to the brink of death, until the physical body itself demanded a mana heart of its own. Among Liam Caravan's descendants, only a few had managed to carry that training through to the very end. He imagined it could be an extremely painful and horrifying process. However, those who overcame the entire training nonetheless became swordmasters. Thus, he wanted to know what the young descendant thought about it, asking whether he felt even a little more motivated after hearing all that. Yet Arhan continued climbing and told his master that he was already far beyond his limit at that moment. Liam once again reminded his disciple that he never lied when it came to the sword. He believed that the mana heart Arhan would attain would be different from any other in that world. Then the scene shifted to nighttime, in a village east of the Verdi region called Campbell, where, in a tavern, people were talking about the rumor surrounding a village called Caravan in the west. To those people, the village of Caravan was a place where no one had been found for over a year. For that reason, they believed it to be haunted. However, a new rumor was circulating at that moment. They said that something existed in that western village, though they did not know what it was. They imagined it to be some kind of dangerous entity, since all the bandits who had set foot there had disappeared without leaving a trace. The rumors claimed that a monstrous wave, sighted by the Northern Watchmen, had swept through the village, or that a sorcerer endowed with magic was there. All kinds of things were being said, but in the end, everyone reached the same conclusion. They should not enter that village if they did not wish to die. However, there was a man drinking in that tavern. He heard about that village, where people died without even entering it. He had a few wounds on his face, and was wiping away the blood as he listened. To him, the village of Caravan sounded like a good place after hearing all that.